Hi. So yeah, I'm Rami Ismail. I'm one half of Dutch independent studio Vlaambeer. Before we start, I have a few questions for you, just so I know who I'm speaking to. Who here knows who I am and what I do? Just raise your hand. Okay, that's enough people who don't know, so you're getting the 15-minute intro. I'm very sorry. Who here is a professional game developer? Who here is a non-professional game developer? Who here is an aspiring game developer or student? Who here just makes games? Who here just plays games? Okay, good. So for those of you who don't know what I do, I am the founder of a small independent studio in the Netherlands. We are best known for games such as Super Crate Box, Ridiculous Fishing, which is a game about fishing with machine guns, Luftrausers, which is a game about airplanes with machine guns, and Nuclear Throne, which is a game about a mutated fish with a guitar with machine guns. I don't know why we keep adding machine guns to things, but it just keeps happening. Oh, and Screen Shake. Yeah, that's also a thing we do. In my daily life, I travel around the world meeting game developers everywhere, trying to find out why they make games, how they make games, and how I can help them make games. And my visit here is part of that. I'm very excited to be here with all of you game creators and gamers. And today, I had a stupid idea for a presentation. I thought, why not take every letter from the alphabet and talk about something important that starts with that letter in game development? So I have a lot to talk about. Some of it is going to be very focused on game development, but I'll try and explain it in such a way that even if you're not a game developer, you can kind of understand why it matters. And some of it is a bit more broad and is about games as a medium or games as a art form. So we're going to start with a technical one, if this button works. This is like the TV in like a hotel when you have to like kind of aim and press 5 times. It's great. Who has heard of this phrase, APX? I won't blame you if you haven't. It only came into existence about a week ago. There's this charity called Able Gamers, and they focus on making games accessible for people with disabilities, whether that is a visual disability like color blindness or blindness, or auditory disabilities like being deaf or hard of hearing, or even mobility disabilities like not being able to use one of your arms, like a half coordinated, a very famous live streamer that speed runs even though he can only use half of his body. APX is what they call accessible player experiences, and it's a new way to think about accessibility in games, making your games playable for as many people as possible. And very often people think, when they think about accessibility, they think, well, but if I make my game more accessible, doesn't it become easier? And don't I lose part of the challenge of my game? And APX in a way argues, no, absolutely not. It's just a way of thinking about your game. So for example, if you're playing a game in which there is any sort of feedback, like taking damage, your screen might flash red, right? When you take damage, your screen flashes red. Very common in games. What APX argues is that's not good enough because you're only using one channel, one stimulus, to communicate that information. So flashing red is great for people who can see color, or for people who can see at all. But if you are blind, then you won't be able to get that information. So using audio or rumble to communicate that as well is actually a very useful way of letting people who normally wouldn't be able to play your game. If you've ever played a FIFA game, you might notice that when you kick the ball, the controller actually rumbles a little. You probably haven't really noticed because it's very subtle, but it's there. And it makes all the difference for people who otherwise can't see. People who play Street Fighter might notice that it is actually possible if you train well enough to play Street Fighter entirely on sound. Even if you couldn't see at all, you can play Street Fighter on sound just because of how the sound cues are built. And if you've ever watched speedrun events like Awesome Games Done Quick, you know that there are a lot of players that can play and speedrun an entire game just based on audio with a blindfold. So if you are making a game, I would ask you to look up this APX. It's available at accessible.games. That's a website. And if you go to accessible.games, you will find 21 design patterns that you can use. Do not communicate just via one thing. Allow people to set their challenge level. Allow people to set the speed of their experience. Just simple things that if you add them in your game early, will make your game accessible for so many people while also just being damn good game design. So the business case of a game, especially if you're a game developer, is something we forget about very often. For those of you who do not make games, let me tell you, a lot of us make games just because we love it. A lot of us also have to pay for rent and food and not dying in general. So a large part of game development actually ends up being business. I'm a programmer by trade. When I was a kid, I always wanted to make video games just because I loved video games. And then when I ended up in a company, it was just 2 people, and the other guy was terrible at business, so I ended up doing the business even though I didn't really want to. It turns out it's very important, and getting your business case right is a lot harder than you think, because when you're not very fluent in business, you might think that a good business case is, well, we're going to promote it by sending it to YouTubers or Twitch streamers. That's not really a business case. One of the most common things I come across when I talk to young developers or new developers is just that they kind of are terrible at writing a good pitch or a business case. The official definition is a justification for a proposed project or undertaking on basis of its expected commercial benefit. So you're kind of explaining why somebody should invest or care about your project based on how much you're going to earn. Let me tell you, in games, if there's one thing I learned, is that there is no way to know how much you're going to earn. Even if you make an amazing game, it might just not sell at all. And if you make Undertale, which most people would argue doesn't look all that impressive and doesn't seem all that impressive, you might make millions because it is a great game. So when you do a business case in game, in many ways it's about knowing what it's going to cost rather than how much it's going to earn. And communicating that, being able to communicate that, is very important. A lot of indies, if you're thinking of being an independent developer, or if you are an independent developer, there's one tip I would give you if you ever have to write a budget. Include your own salary. It makes a world of difference. If I see a publisher pitch deck and they say, well, we need 20,000 euros to finish this game with 4 people in a year or 2 years, I skip. Because if you can't even pay yourself, then I don't really have any faith in you being able to run a business, not now, and definitely not in the future. So if you do that, please budget yourself, budget your hours, budget your work. Fun thing. So I want to do a small example with a small exercise with you, just because I want to show you that communication is terrible. So I'm going to say a word, and I want you to just think of the very first word that comes to mind. And if language works the way we think it works, we should all kind of have similar words, right? We should all kind of think of the same thing. So a word I like using for this example is the word sun, which is burning ball of lava in the sky. So I'm just going to point at somebody, and then you tell me which word you think of. Okay, here in the first row. Star. Everybody who had star, can you raise your hand? That is one person. How about you over there with the shawl? Warmth, sure. 4 people? 4 people. You. Yeah. You said star as well. Well then, next to you. Light. 7-ish, 8, yeah, 7, 8 people. That's nice. Is there anybody who thinks they have a word that's 25% of the room? Sorry? Moon. 3 people. Anybody else? 25% of the room. Summer? Nobody? 1 person. Summer. 2, 3. Okay. So this is why language is terrible. Even though we think we agree about things, very often we don't actually agree about things. We just think we agree about things. So an exercise I do with students very often when I teach at universities is I give them 20 minutes to ask me any question about a game I want them to make, and then they get 2 days to make it. They ask me, well, what kind of game is it? And I say, well, it's a platformer. And they say, what kind of platformer? And I go, it's a platformer. What do you mean, what kind of platformer? And they go, well, what's the goal of the game? I'm like, to get to the end of the level. It's a platformer. And they're like, okay, well, what are you? Do you walk? I'm like, yeah. Do you run? Yeah. Jump? Yeah. Of course, it's a platformer. Okay, are there enemies? I'm like, yeah. They're like, can you fall? I'm like, yeah. I don't know. That will kill you. They're like, oh, okay. Are there enemies? Yeah, there's enemies. I just said there's enemies. What can you do with them? Well, you can jump on them. They can touch you and kill you. Like, are there power-ups? Yes, there's power-ups. Like, what kind of power-ups? Like, well, there's one that makes you grow, right? So, sometimes they ask, are you a plumber? And I'm like, yeah, you are. So, they make Super Mario Bros. And then I fail all of them because what I want is Mario 64. So you can agree about everything and still disagree about something just because you didn't ask the right questions. One pro tip in communication, always. If you're communicating anything at all, communicate via the maximum amount and the most appropriate amount of media. So if you're doing something art related, please don't try to talk about art. Draw art. If you're trying to communicate sound, please don't talk about sound. Use sound. I have a sound designer. If he's making an explosion sound, and I say like, well, it needs a little bit more rumble, that can mean a million things. Just go to him and I go like, well, it's more like the way it sounds now. It's like, and I would like. Then you can just fix it, because that's all. Like, there's no arguing about that. I just made the sound. I just want more of that. If you're talking about programming, don't just talk about it. If you can, make a flowchart. Write pseudocode. Give something in the language of the person you're communicating with. This is a great way of avoiding a lot of wasted time, because those examples of people making Super Mario when I want Mario 64, that happens in commercial context as well. Happens a lot in commercial projects where people are working on something for a while and then after 2 weeks they find out that, oh, okay, you meant third person, right, okay. We'll restart on that. Who has heard of the door problem? So if you haven't and you are a game designer, go find this article by Liz England. She's incredible. The idea is very simple. The simplest thing you can think of in a game might be a door, right? It's a door. Everybody knows how a door works. Everybody knows what it should do. So if you were to implement a game door, what kind of problems might you run into? Well, first of all, you might wonder, well, how does the door open? Does it open in or out? Or does it slide? Okay, well, let's say it opens out. Okay, so what if the player is standing where the door opens? Does it push the player or does it go through the player? Well, pick something. Kill the player, also an option. This would be an interesting game. You stand at the door and you're like, went the other way. Cool. I'd like that game. That's good. Anybody else? Towards or through the player? Let's not do kill the player. I think a lot of people would be very upset. It pushes the player. Okay. So what if there's a wall behind the player? It crushes the player. Alright. This is a very violent game all of a sudden. I don't know what kind of doors you have here in Lithuania, but you need some health security standards. Okay. So say that. Okay, what does a door look like? Is it made out of wood? Is it made out of metal? It's made out of glass. That's a very strong glass door if it can crush people. Okay, so it's made out of glass. What if the player has a weapon? If you shoot at the door, should the door break? Then it attacks. You have very weird doors here. Even something as simple as a door, you can ask hundreds of questions before you can actually implement it. If it's a multiplayer game and two people from opposite sides of the door open the door at the same time, what should happen? If the door is destructible versus doors that are not destructible, how do you communicate the difference? What kind of button do you use to interact with the door? Is it the same button as reload? Is it a separate button? Is there a dedicated door open button, which in this door horror game might be a good idea? Liz does a really good job of explaining all of these questions and also explaining all of the disciplines that are part of just creating a door. So if you are interested in game design, this is a really good one to look up. If you are in game design and you haven't read it, please go read it. I'm getting better at this remote. So we are at an expo, which is great. If you're a game developer and you have, how many of you are working actively on a game right now? Okay. Well, I very much appreciate that you're here at my talk. Please go showcase at expos. It is by far one of the nicest ways to get feedback. And you know why it is a nice way to get feedback? Because the people downstairs checking out those games, they're not your friends, and they don't care about hurting your feelings. Which honestly is the best way to get feedback. It's also a rough way to get feedback. Bring your game to expos. I'm honestly surprised that I've not been to Lithuania before, because the location here is kind of magnificent. You're 2 hours away from so many great places in all directions, honestly. That if you're not showcasing your games, start showcasing your games. Make a little bit of budget available. Go to Gamescom. Go to PAX Paris. Go to Indicate. Go to DevGum, go to the expo here, showcase everywhere, because honestly, it's not that far. And you will get feedback on your game like you've never had before. Honestly, when I go to expos, I even practice my pitches for my game. The sentences that I will put on my store page, on my Steam page, often comes from gamers that come to play my game that I'm showcasing before it's released, and they bring their friend. They're like, yeah, no, look, you should check out this game. It's fishing with machine guns. And I'm like, here we go. Honestly, expos are one of the best ways to get feedback and information and perspective on what you're working on, because if you are working on a game, it's so easy to get so close to it because you care so much and you're so passionate about it, you kind of forget perspective. And perspective ends up being kind of crucial in, making a game. Who's ever heard of Fitt's Law? Oh, this is going to be fun. One person. There was this guy named Paul Morris Fitts, and he came up with what is probably the simplest sounding law in the history of mankind. With law, I don't mean like a legal law, I mean an interaction law. So his law literally says the time required to rapidly move to a target area is a function of the ratio between the distance to the target and the width of the target. Which basically means that if you want to click on something with a mouse, the further away the mouse is from the thing you want to click, and the smaller the thing is you want to click, the harder it is to click. Which doesn't sound super intelligent when you think about it. This guy got famous for this thing. But I can tell you why he got famous. When you think of a computer screen, how many of you use Windows? Okay, we're going to use Windows. Most of you know how Windows looks. What is the biggest thing on the screen always? Desktop? The corner? Anybody else? I heard somebody say start button. Who said start button? Sorry? Update now. Besides the update screen. The blue screen of death, yes. No, the correct answer is indeed, it's the largest button on the screen will be the start button, and the reason for that is that it's in the corner. What happens when your mouse hits the edge of the screen? It stays there. It never moves further than that. So what happens when the mouse hits the corner of the screen? It stays in exactly one spot, which is that corner. Where's the start button? In that corner. That means that even if you weren't watching and you weren't trying and you just grabbed your mouse and you just swung it off the table to the bottom left, you know where your mouse ends? On the start button. Because the start button is infinite. It is the single largest thing on the screen is the start button. That doesn't sound super interesting, but when you think about it, a lot of games use this information as well. If you've ever played a game, if you ever played Destiny, you might notice that when you move your mouse over an item, the item gets slightly larger and the mouse gets slightly slower, and it just makes the button larger because the mouse slows down, because the button gets larger. So it makes it a lot easier to actually press that button. When you think about it, a lot of simple laws like this are at the core of how we interact with computers. And when you're making games, it's good to think of simple laws that represent your games. So for Vlambeer, one of our simple laws is that if there's any button that you can hold in the game, there has to be a reason to let it go. Which sounds super simple. But it's actually defined a number of our games. In Luftrausers, if you hold the shoot button, you don't heal. If you let go of the shoot button, you start healing. It's a very simple thing, but it defines the entire pacing and the entire gameplay of the game. And it's part of what makes the game interesting, because you have to choose between attack and defense, between offense and fleeing. And that simple rule is so easy to understand for players, but it makes such a depth of gameplay that basing your game around simple laws like that might actually be one of the most efficient ways of creating interesting gameplay. How many of you have a game on Steam? Game on PlayStation. Any game on a commercial platform? How many of you took screenshots for that? How much time did you take on the screenshots? Hours? Okay. Anybody else? Weeks? Few hours? So the screenshot making process for a Vlambeer game starts as soon as we have a build that visually looks like the final build. And then the honest truth is, we just run a script in the background that takes a screenshot like every 5 seconds. And if there's anything interesting that happens during a playthrough, we quit the game, we go and check the screenshots, and if it's good, we set it aside. And by the time we're ready to put a store page up, we have 200, 300, 400 screenshots. And from those 200, 300, 400, we pick 5. So weeks is closer to what we do. The reason I take weeks is because these 5 screenshots, they're the only thing people are going to see when they go to the store. And they're going to see them, and based on that, they're going to choose whether they're going to give me $12.99 for the 3 years of work I put in. Game development is kind of messed up. We work for 3 years, and at the end, we flip a coin, and then we hope you buy it. Not very smart, honestly. Screenshots are one way to make sure that people will have a higher chance of buying your game, and the same thing goes for trailers. How many of you here are video editors? How many of you do their own trailers? Don't. If you're not a professional video editor, just get somebody to do it, unless you're really good at this by accident, in which case, hey, do it yourself. But please, when you're selling a thing, don't forget, you get 2 seconds of impression before somebody goes, I'm not interested in this, and then your 3 years of work are gone. Here's some game theory for you. Who knows the human-computer interaction loop? So it's simple. You have the player, or what we call the mental model, then we have the input, we have the game, we have the feedback, or output. So the player is what the player thinks they know about the game. And that doesn't start with booting up the game. It starts with seeing marketing. It starts with seeing the first screenshots. It starts with the trailers. That's when the game actually begins. They boot up a game for the first time. The easiest way to explain a mental model is when you boot up a game and you see the logo of the company that made it, right? Ubisoft. Now, what are you going to do? You're going to wait until the logo goes away, or you're going to hit the spacebar? How many people are just going to wait? Nobody's going to wait. Great. This is why I had logos. So if the logo goes away, the next time you boot up the game, what are you going to do? You're just going to hit spacebar. If the logo stays, even if you press spacebar, what are you going to do next time? You try another button. That's your mental model. That's the simplest version of a mental model. Every time a player tries something, when something changes in the game, they update their mental model. And it can be as simple as the logo doesn't go away when I press a button, or the logo does go away when I press a button. So based on what the player knows about the game, what they can do, what their options are, what their powers are, what their abilities are, their items, they're going to press buttons. Those buttons are your input. The input goes into the game. The game processes that input and then updates the game based on the input. Now here's the weird thing about that. You can't see that. When the game changes, it doesn't actually show you. It just changes. After that, the game is responsible for creating feedback to the player and telling them what happened. And then based on that feedback, the player updates their mental model. That's how a game works. Now, where does the game actually take place? Does it happen in the player, in the input, in the game, or in the output? Anybody? The game happens only in the player. That's ultimately where the game happens, because everything else is kind of bullshit. Am I allowed to say that? No, okay. Everything else is nonsense. Apologies. Let's put it this way. If you're playing a game that tells you that you have a chance of 10% of a certain item drop, how many times do you have to try before you get the item? Anybody? So the correct answer is you don't know. Which sounds weird, because for a lot of people it might feel like it's 10 times. 10 times 10 is 100%, right? That's obviously not how chances work. It's just how our brain thinks chances work. So in a lot of games that do percentage-based loot, there's actually sort of like backups. Destiny just added a backup for their game, where if there's a 10% drop chance for an item and you try 20 times and you don't get it, it might increase the chances for that drop. You know why? Because people don't want fair games. You've ever played a platformer? When this is the edge and I'm standing here and I press jump, I should jump. If I stand here, I should fall and die. Do you think games do that? They don't. What games do is for 1 or 2 frames after you step off the edge, we do something called coyote time, which is named after Wile E. Coyote, who always, hangs in the sky for a minute before he falls off an edge. During those frames, you can still jump. Not because it's fair, because otherwise the people feel it's unfair. We don't do chances that are real. When we roll a die in a game, do you think we're actually just running a random? Hell no, you'd all get super angry. Gamers don't like fair games per se. The only times they like fair games, honestly, is if it's one of those masochore games that's really built around being fair and brutal to you. Otherwise, people just want to have a good time. They don't really care about fair. They don't really care about honest. They care about is that it feels fair. Feels fair, not is fair. They're very different things. And because the game takes place in the player, the game doesn't have to be fair for it to feel fair. In fact, cheating a bit towards the player feels more fair than being honest. I don't know why it is, but it's how psychology works. So, iteration. Well, for most of you that are game developers, you've heard this word, right? The basic version is, that's the one truth about game development? Nobody knows what they're doing. That's the only truth. The reality is that we're working in the strangest place between creativity and technology and art and programming and getting computers to do what we want. Nobody knows what they're doing. The closest we can get to knowing what we're doing is we can know that we should iterate. So we try, we test, and if it's not good, we remove it and we try again. If it's kind of good, we figure out what's working, remove the rest, and try again. Game development is about trying. This is why when people are working on a game just early on in the process, they don't talk about their game. Because when I was doing Nuclear Throne, and I told on the forums, I said, well, we're trying some multiplayer stuff. I don't think it's going to be in the game, but we're just going to check. About a year and a half later, when we realized that we couldn't do multiplayer, I got a lot of hate mail because we had promised we would do 4-person PvP, which we didn't. We just said we might do multiplayer. Iteration just means that we don't know what we're doing and we're trying to find out. That also means that games change a lot in development, that what we think will be a good game might not be the game we end up making. Nuclear Throne is a top-down roguelike. It started as a first-person shooter until we realized we were shit at first-person shooters, so we turned it into a roguelike. It's iteration. Things change. Ooh, I'm gonna have to go fast. Juice. I'm not even halfway. Juice. If you shoot a weapon in a game, what should the weapon feel like? Powerful. If you punch somebody, it should feel like you hit something. If you've seen the recent development diaries of God of War, one of the coolest things I've ever seen is when Kratos swings his axe, it uses kinetic animation to move his arm. If you hit somebody, they kind of lock the axe in place while the animation continues, and then after a few frames, they move the axe forward, so that when you hit, the axe stops, the arm moves, and then after a moment, it unlocks and switches through. It's juicy. It feels good. It looks good. It feels like you're hitting something. That's juice. Now, it's very easy to think that you should add juice to everything, but the reality is that juice should be added mostly to the things that matter. So let's use a platformer again. What is the most important thing a player will ever do in a platformer? No. It is not jump. What? Die? No, that's a bad thing. Should also have juice. Fall? Also no. What? Walk? No, that's the most common thing you do, not the most important thing you do. Stop? No. Land. Land. Jump, you can do all the time. Land is when you nailed it. So what should feel good? Landing. Every jump that you land should feel good. If you do a long jump, your character should land and roll. Little smoke effects, little inputs. Yes, when you jump, there should be a little puff. When you land, there should be an effect. It should feel like you nailed it. Because landing ultimately is what matters. Because I can jump and die. That's not super cool. Does that mean that you shouldn't take care about the jump? No, the jump is the action. The landing is the result. Both are very important. Dying should also be juicy, because it means you messed up, and that's also important to communicate. So make sure that things that affect the player and that show players success or failure, that those are juicy. Juicy can be anything. It can mean effects, it can mean sounds, it can mean animation, but just make sure that they communicate more than anything else, because honestly, players are kind of interface blind, just by default. You can put a giant, let's use Destiny again. In Destiny, they put supercharged on your screen in giant yellow letters, and they had to put a blinking yellow interface in the bottom left because nobody sees it. Because nobody sees the big yellow letters in the center of the screen. Let me tell you, players will miss anything that's not giant. If you're an interface designer, if you think something is too big, it's half too small. That's just how it works. Now, the continuation of Juice's kinesthetics, and it's actually the physical impact of pressing a button. So when you shoot a gun in a game, which button is that on a controller? It's usually the trigger. Why is it the trigger? Because you shoot with a trigger. Same thing with a vehicle. You accelerate with a pedal, which has the kinesthetic qualities of a trigger. When you think about how you put input on a controller or how you map to a keyboard, it's important to think about that stuff. It's one of the reasons why run tends to be on the left stick, because it actually kind of makes it harder to move left or right. It's just a nice effect. It became a standard because it works. But it originally was chosen because if you hold the left stick and move it forward, it's hard to also move it left and right because your thumb is using force downwards to press that stick. When you put something on any point of your controller, your keyboard, think about the kinesthetic. Think about the impact of hitting that button. The effect of hitting a space bar is very different from the effect of hitting the E button. So think about that if you're making a game. So if you're ever making a game, think early on about how to localize it. One of the biggest complaints I've ever seen in game development is having to translate a game to German. It has nothing to do with German. Well, it has nothing to do with the Germans. It also has nothing to do with Germany. No worries, you all are good. It has something to do with the German language, just using like 30% more characters than any other language in the world to communicate the same thing. We have no idea why that is. The Germans just like their letters. So if you make a text box, let me reassure you that when you translate to German, it won't fit, no matter what's in there. So if you're going to translate your game, think about these kind of things early. Actually do research before you start implementing anything text related. If you want to implement Arabic, think about the fact that Arabic reads from right to left instead of left to right. So that if you make your interface a left to right based interface, it's not going to work in Arabic. So if you want to localize to Arabic, you got to start with that before you make any menu or UI interface. So, you need three things to make a video game. You need knowledge, you need money, and you need motivation. Now, if you lose one of these three, let's say you lose money. So you have knowledge and you have motivation. Can you make a game? Of course. You just don't get paid. You're going to be poor, it's going to be miserable. But hey, you can make a game. You can make it in your spare time. If you don't have knowledge, but you have money and you have motivation, can you make a game? Yeah, you just hire somebody who does have the knowledge. If you have money and you have knowledge, but you don't have motivation, are you going to be able to make a game? No, why the hell would you make a game if you're not motivated to? So here's the thing. People always argue that it's important to have money, that it's important to have knowledge. You know the thing that matters most? It's your motivation. You know how you keep your motivation? Don't burn yourself out. The games industry is a place of passion. Everybody that's here in this room, what day is it today? Friday. I came from Australia. I have no idea what day it is. You are in a little room. The weather is not terrible. On a Friday afternoon. You're probably going to be back here tomorrow on a Saturday, which is your weekend, to sit in a small room, listen to people talk about video game development. The only reason you would ever do that is because you care. Because otherwise there's no good reason to be in this room, honestly. Like, you care about video games. That's why you're here. Whether you care about the development of video games, whether you care about playing video games, doesn't really matter. The only reason to be in this room is because you care so much to not be anywhere else. Right? So one of the fastest way to kill that love, that passion for games, is to just crush yourself trying to make one. So if there's one thing I recommend each team working on a game, it's not programming related, it's not design related, it's not related to anything. It's related to take care of yourself. When we were working on Ridiculous Fishing, I'd been working non-stop for 3 years. I slept in the office. I would wake up late and then go to work and then work until I couldn't work anymore. And for the first year and a half, it was great. We didn't actually do anything super successful, but it felt nice. It was kind of what everybody was doing, so we thought it was cool. And after a year and a half, our game Ridiculous Fishing got cloned, which means that another studio, before we were done with the game, stole the idea and released the game on the App Store. They made over $1 million in a few weeks with our game. And it was not good. You know what it did? It made us realize that we were tired. It took a year and a half to realize we were tired. You know what that did? Every time I would open my computer, and I've been making games since I was 6, right? Since I was 6, I wanted to be a programmer. Wasn't a good programmer, but I wanted to be a programmer. I've been trying since I was 6. It's all I've been good at my entire life. It's all I've trained for, practiced for my entire life, was how to make video games. You know what happened? I would open my computer, and the cursor would start blinking, and I would get a headache. Just get a headache straight away. Not just a little headache, like piercing headache. Like not be able to look at the screen headache. You know what? I would close my computer because I literally could not. I was not capable of working. And it sounds like an exaggeration, but let me tell you, it was not an exaggeration. If I had any way to make games, I would make games. Being tired, I don't care, like I would make games. That's the moment I realized that there's a way to lose all this. And it's just not taking care of myself. So if you make games, more than anything, your motivation, protect that. More than the money, more than your knowledge, more than anything, protect your love for video games. Because in the end, that's what put you in this room. So if you ever make a commercial video game, if you want to negotiate with somebody, you're probably going to be negotiating with a publisher. If you're negotiating with a publisher, it's easy to think that you're the one that needs them. Let me tell you, if you're a game developer without a publisher, you can still release a video game. If they're a publisher without a video game, they're out of business. In the end, they will always need you. That doesn't mean that they need exactly you or exactly your game. That's where the negotiations come in. But if you're going to be negotiating, try to make sure that you have information on who they are, what they do, that they fit your game, that they fit you. Talk to them about stuff like that. Money is important too, absolutely, but make sure they're fit. Make sure they understand what you want. Make sure that you're comfortable with the people. Don't forget that everybody you talk to at a publisher is developer relationship, and their job is literally to make sure that you like them. That's their entire job. So when you pitch their game, they're always going to say the following. That's a very cool game. Yeah, you should keep us up to date on that. Yeah, here's my email. Here's my card. Just when you have a new build, send it over. They'll say the same thing. Whether they love your game, whether they hate your game, whether they never want to invest in it, that's always what they're going to say. Because it will make you like them. And maybe when your next game is not terrible, you'll reach out to them again. So don't worry too much about any of that. Don't worry too much about pitching. Practice. If you're at an event, take any meeting, take any opportunity to practice your pitch, to practice your negotiation. And then when you negotiate, feel free to aim a little high. It's better to aim a little high. Same thing with Kickstarters. Aim higher than you think. One of the worst negotiations I ever did, I asked for $30,000 for a Flash game. You know what they said? They said yes. It was the worst. They didn't even ask. They're not like, 30, that's a bit much. No, they were like, okay, yeah, sure. Awesome. We thought 100, but hey, if you say 30. So yeah, always aim a little high, because the worst thing that's going to happen, they're going to go like, that's a bit much. And you're going to go, okay, we can probably do it for 70. And they're like, oh, okay, that's fair. I just wanted to put this up again, because I was talking about motivation earlier. Crunch, don't do it. Overtime, don't do it. If you can avoid it in any way, just don't. It's never worth it. It's not good for the quality of your game. It'll never be good. Who here thinks that games are the most modern media on earth? Play is the oldest medium on earth. It is probably older than language itself. It turns out that the people, when we were still living in caves, the people that played were better at life. In fact, if you practiced how to throw a spear by aiming it at a tree, you had a higher chance of hitting an animal when you needed to. If you practiced climbing rocks, you'd be more equipped to flee if a predator would find you. From the start of time, the people that played more were more capable of dealing with life. And that's still true today. In fact, when you look at kids, the way they learn how to deal with the world is not through learning at school, no, it's through playing. They play, and then they find out that if you walk into a wall, that hurts. Don't walk into a wall. You can try and teach that through school, but the walking into a wall is definitely going to help. So We are, in a way, the torchbearers of the oldest medium on Earth. Playing is how we learn how to interact with the world. Playing is how I learned about history. It's how I learned about strategy. It's how I learned about sports, honestly. I learned about sports through video games. I played soccer in FIFA before I played soccer in real life. A lot of things in life we learn through playing. Don't forget that games have that power. That we're not just entertainment. The idea that games are just entertainment, yeah, sure, we're entertainment. We're fun. It's good. Have a great time in your game. But any game that you play is going to make you better at something. There's a reason that pilots are trained using flight simulators. And you know what flight simulators are? Games. They're just an opportunity to practice without consequences. I have a few letters left, so sorry. I'm going to be a little overtime. QA. If you want to do your QA people one favor, don't say QA as a verb. It's not a thing you verb. It's not a thing you do. QA is many things. It's testing, but it's also analyzing, documenting, data processing, recording, reporting. It's a lot of things at once. QA is not something you just do. And if you are a developer, you should not be QA. If you're making the game, you should not be testing. If you're making the game, you should not be in charge of seeing whether the progression is good or the tutorial is good. If you are developing, find QA people. Find people who can do QA, not just a random person. Find somebody who can actually do QA. Who can play your game over and over, trying the same exploit 100 times until they figure out how to reproduce the bug. That's QA. That's not a thing you just do. If you want to release your game on a console platform, you're going to need QA. If you're going to release your game anywhere commercially, you probably want QA. If you want to release a game on console, how many of you have released a game on console? How many of you want to release a game on console? Let me tell you, releasing a game on console was one of the biggest nightmares of my life. Because on PC, you just make your build, you send it to Steam, and you release it, and it's great. On console, you send your build in, and you get this giant form back that's just, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. It turns out there's a giant guide of certification guidelines that you have to keep to. And some of them are ridiculous. Have you ever wondered why every console game starts with you have to like press a button on your controller? Why is that? I can tell you why it is. It's because on old consoles, we had to figure out what controller was player one. This is from like way back. This is not a modern thing. It just stayed in certification, so it's still there. So you still have to press A, even though now you're logged in with profiles and we know who player one is. You still have to press A to give controller one to a player. The same thing with my HUD interface. You know how a lot of games have the thing where you have to say where the corners of your TV are? You know why they do that? It's because if you don't do that, you can't actually use the outer 10% of your screen for HUD elements. It's called the title save region. If you don't do that thing at the start of your screen or you don't keep to those things, you might get failed in certification. If you get failed on certification, you know what that means? It means you wait a week until you can submit again. That's if things go fast. And then you wait another week, week and a half for them to test stuff. You know what they do? They don't test everything. No, as soon as they come across one or two things that just won't pass cert, they'll just send it back and go like, fix these two things first and then in 3 weeks we'll talk again. This is why release dates on console also are terrible, because if you're an indie, they're not going to make exceptions or prioritizations for you. If you're AAA, maybe. Fix it in a day one patch, right? But otherwise, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that leeway. If you design any video games, check out this talk. I'm not going to go into this because I could talk about this for 20 minutes and I have -3. Subway legibility is the idea that if you make a game, it should be so easy to understand that the person sitting next to you in the train should be able to look at your screen and understand what's happening. They don't have to understand it perfectly, but they should kind of be able to look at it and go like, oh, right, it's a turn-based strategy game. And there's like, I guess you have to survive against zombies or something. I don't know. Like something like that, right? It's a talk by a guy named Zach Gage who worked with me on Ridiculous Fishing. Just search for this exact phrase, subway legibility. And I promise you, just reading this one article will make you a better game developer. Who's ever heard of triage? Good, a few of you. It's basically prioritization. If you're making a game, you're going to have to eventually prioritize what you want to work on. And triage is sort of like the phrase that we use for like, it's not necessarily emergency prioritization, but it's really getting a good inventory of what needs to be done. It's a function of 3 things: necessity, severity, and resource availability. So how much can we fix? How important is it to fix? And how bad is it? A good example would be recently, if you downloaded the Fallout 76 beta, there was a bug that the launcher could delete all 50 gigabytes of your download for no reason whatsoever. Which, since the beta was 4 days, 50 gigabytes, you have good internet here, by the way. Like, damn, that's nice. Even my hotel has good internet. I was in Australia 4 days ago. They don't have good internet. If I had to re-download 50 gigabytes, that would just be 2 days of the beta gone. That's kind of what you're looking at when you're triaging, is how important are things. And triage is weird because sometimes there's an edge case that's really bad. Like, for example, delete the 50 gigabyte data. That's pretty bad. You can say, well, it only happens once in a million, which isn't that bad. But then what if your game gets downloaded 10 million times? The chance of 1 in 10 million or 1 in a million across 10 million people might be 10 people. It might be 100 people. It might also be 50,000 people. That's how chances work. You don't quite know. So edge cases can become very relevant as soon as the skill goes up. Keep that in mind, that triage doesn't necessarily mean how rare is it. It's also how bad would it be if it actually happened. If you're accidentally going to if you're accidentally going to forward everybody's emails to Twitter 1 in 10 billion times, you should probably still fix that bug before you release your video game, even though it will only happen once in 10 billion times. You know what? User interface, I can talk about that a lot, but let's take the very short version. Your user interface should be based on what kind of game you're making. Whenever you see a player play your game at an expo, a playtest, or anything, see for what thing they're looking for when they're testing. Don't try and see what they're doing on the screen. Look at their face. If you ever see confusion, look what's on the screen. It just means they're missing something. One of the most common ones in an arcade game or a high score game where you have to keep going, no restart button. It's the most common frustration I've ever heard in any arcade game ever. It's just there's no easy restart button. When you do UX, think about the player flow, think about what they want, think about where they want to go, and make sure that there's a button like that somewhere on the screen. Who's heard the phrase vertical slice? Good. For those of you who don't know it, a prototype is a very simple, basic version of your game. It's usually with low graphics. It's usually not made to be pretty. It's made to communicate how it plays. A vertical slice is a small segment of your game, say a vertical slice, that is made to the production quality that you expect from the final product. So it is something that looks like the final product would look. It's something that sounds like the final product would look. It's something that plays like how the final product would look. It's just a tiny part of it. Half a level, a sequence, one interaction, one moment. Vertical slices are very, very useful in trying to figure out how long it's going to take to make your game, how much work it's going to be to make your game, but also to just get the team on the same page. When I was doing that exercise with you about the sun, that's what a vertical slice fixes. Because if you can do that fast in a few weeks at the start of your project, you never have to argue about anything again. You don't have to argue again about how it sounds, about how it looks, about where it'll just be obvious. Just look at the vertical slice. So if you can, make a vertical slice. How many of you are indies? One more time. Okay. For all of you that are indies, you know when most indie studios fail? Well, it's before releasing their first game. But if they make it through their first game, you know where most indies fail? Before they start their second game. You know why? They always end up fighting about their second game. I don't know why. It's just indies usually start out of necessity. Everybody wants to make the same game. So they start working on the game and then they release it and it's a huge success and now they have to make a second game and it turns out that they don't agree on the second game. I don't know why that happens, but it keeps happening. I keep getting called by indies to talk to their teams because they're in a fight about what their second game should be. You know what? 30 to 50% of those studios just don't make it because they've never had to argue about something before. And it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird to think that you can work with somebody for 2 years and then eventually for the second game it just doesn't work. One big part of that is work culture. It's making sure that when you work together, you are aware of the culture you're creating, of what culture the people that you work with have. It's also very important if you ever want to grow, because having people that fit your work culture ends up being very important in making sure that you maintain somewhat of a spirit of cohesion in your studio. That doesn't mean to never hire somebody that's outside your work culture. It actually makes your company stronger to have a diverse input of perspectives. But it does mean that people have to fit in certain ways to be able to work with you. Excel, who loves Excel? Okay, make more video games and you will love Excel. Let me tell you, spreadsheets are the best thing that ever happened to the world. I say that as somebody who doesn't like spreadsheets, but honestly, the amount of game development and game design stuff that I do in Excel is ridiculous. For balancing, for figuring out where to put what, for prioritization, for keeping track of things, for project management, for budgeting, for anything, I use Excel more than I use some of my programming tools, which I didn't think that would be true when I really didn't want to use Excel that much. Oh well. Use Excel. Honestly, it'll save you a lot of time. Who's ever heard the word Yomi? It's a card game by a guy named David Serlins, Yomi fighting card game. It's a Japanese word for reading. It is, I think that you think that I think that you think that I think. You can design Yomi in levels. So one level is Yomi is, I think that you're going to do something. And the second level is Yomi is, I think that you're going to do something, so I'm going to do something else. Then third level of Yomi, when you play a fighter game, that's basically what's happening all the time. Yomi is an extremely useful game design tool that if you've never heard of it, I would recommend you look up because especially in multiplayer games or games you play together, card games, board games, it ends up being a huge part of what you're actually designing, even though you might not be aware of it. Who's heard of zero-sum games? Okay. Zero-sum games are interesting because it means that if some player wins, the other players can't. In a way, they're kind of the least interesting type of game design. But then on the other side, when you look at it, something like Fortnite proves that that's not entirely true because people do like zero-sum games. The theory behind zero-sum games is kind of complicated and kind of mathematical in a weird way. If you are a game designer who hasn't read up on things like Pareto efficiency and zero-sum games and payoff matrices, stuff like that, go read up on that. It's not that much work. It might seem a little complicated at first, but just knowing that there is that much knowledge behind very basic ideas of game design might help a lot in trying to figure out what else you don't know yet. I'm way over time, so I had a question slide. I think I have no time for questions, I'm gonna guess. Okay, let's do, I got a clock. They gave me a clock. I got 4 minutes and 50 seconds for questions. So questions. Okay, let me talk about questions then. Asking questions is hard, but let me tell you, moments like this where you have somebody that you can ask questions of that isn't yourself is actually very useful. So even though questions are hard, I'm sure some of you are wondering something. It doesn't have to be about this talk, just anything at all. Yes, there you go.
For example, you mentioned Excel sheets. How do you measure numerical balance between, for example, melee attacks and high-range attacks?
Well, one of the things you could do is you could just codify what range is. Is range a distance in pixels? Is range a distance in... he's asking in an Excel spreadsheet, how do you balance more complicated things, right? Like a range melee attack versus range attacks. You can codify it. Like a melee attack would be a range of 20 pixels, while a longer range attack would be something else. Most damage output is probably based around some sort of formula in a game. Some people do the genius design sort of thing, where you just come up with numbers until it feels good. That's fine. But if you want to have a bit more control about that, using a formula or using some sort of formula to kind of balance and base your numbers around that, not even use those numbers, but just kind of get a feeling of where they approximately should be, can really help. Because then you can go like, well, I want to add an attack that has 100 range, twice as large as anything else. Just go like, well, let's see what 100 should probably be. Rate of fire is often added to that, like how fast can you use an attack. And then based on that, you can get a pretty good idea. Halo famously used the Excel spreadsheet, the original Halo. Has anybody played the original Halo? Does anybody remember that the pistol was like way overpowered? You know what happened there? So what happened there is they had this spreadsheet and they updated all sorts of numbers in that to make sure everything was balanced. And then during one of the last playtests, they actually found that the pistol was being underused. And they didn't have time to like recalculate all the balance for all the weapons and items in the game, so they just kind of upped that number. And that's why the pistol is super OP. Because it just actually is OP. Like, it's actually an overpowered weapon. And they knew it. That's how you make iconic weapons. Not everything has to be balanced. Any other questions? Localization is huge. If you manage to localize your game before launch, the effect of localization is much larger than if you do it post-launch. But it can double sales easily. We've seen super good effect with eFigs, which is English, French, Italian, German, Spanish. If you add Brazilian Portuguese, simplified Chinese, the effect is even larger. But yeah, it mainly seems to matter at launch. After launch, the effect seems much less pronounced. Any other questions? Yeah. Vertical slices. Yeah. 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 So cheat. If you're making a vertical engine, vertical slice, you end up having to create the entire engine. Is kind of the question. Like that seems like a lot of research for something that simple. I would argue that getting as much of it properly is great, but the idea of a vertical slice is to kind of be quick and dirty. So just kind of cheat. If you have certain effects that you want in the game and you can't do them properly, just do them poorly. Like the point of a vertical slice is not to be perfect code. It's to be an example of what the game should be like. So you can even use, as far as I'm concerned, you can use a different engine. You can use a prototyping tool. You can use whatever, just as long as you have something to point at and be like, that's our goal. That's where we're going. And then if you want to roll your own engine, I wouldn't do that. But if you want to do that, go do it. 45 seconds. Quick questions. Okay. French might be longer than German in some cases, yes. Nice. Any other questions? Come on, 45 seconds. Don't make this awkward. Yes. I like less people because it means less payout. It just means that I can survive way longer than if I was 20 people. That's honestly the only reason. It just sounds like more work to have more people. 10. The entire most important goal for any of our games is to start something that nobody else has started before, both in design and business. Always. New genre, new business model, new thing. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, I would be broke. The reason I published my first game was honestly because it was the point where I had to start earning money. That was the reason I did it. I'm at 0. If you have any other questions, find me outside the room right there. I'll be answering questions there for like 10, 15 minutes until my next meeting or something. Thank you so much for being a great audience.